Welcome to the Unity and Struggle YouTube series on race and capitalism. Unity and Struggle is a revolutionary grouping, and in this moment, we see our role as mostly preparing the conditions for mass revolutionary movements to emerge. We do this by getting involved in local organizing, what some have termed base building work, and taking theoretical study and reflection seriously. Many of us have participated in various waves of struggle, dating from the 2001 anti-war movement to the more recent 2014 and 2020 Black Lives Matter movements. At times, we do intensive national studies to help make sense of the conditions that are unfolding around us, and this is one of those times. We are very excited to continue our long-term study on race and capitalism and the mutually constituting relationship between the two. This episode covers the first section of part 2 of our race study. For part 1, we synthesized our lessons periodically with the Rev Left Radio podcast and focused primarily on the antebellum period of the United States. You can find links to those interviews and our syllabi linked in the show notes, as well as on our website at unityandstruggle.org. We'll be continuing our study here on YouTube, and for part 2, we'll be covering 3 different sections: settler colonialism, Reconstruction in the United States, and segregation and industrialization. For this episode, the first section is on settler colonialism. We don't claim to be experts, but political co-thinkers attempting to understand one dimension of the social relations of our world. So thanks for joining us in this endeavor. Please share, comment, and follow along. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or on social media. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is at Unity and Strug. My name is Leila, and I'll be facilitating this discussion with Eve and Sis. To start us off, Sis will give us a little intro on the text we're discussing for this episode.
Thanks, Leila. So in the first part of our study, we were able to build up some foundational understandings of race, but with a narrower focus on the Black-white relation, we weren't able to see as clearly how different racialization processes unfold and what their relation to one another is. So in part 2, we're beginning to expand our understanding a bit. In this section, our focus is settler colonialism and indigeneity. We read a number of pieces that provided historical context, including selections from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States and Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Other texts that we read made theoretical arguments, including around settler colonialism and the subjective and objective factors involved in indigenous racialization processes, as well as identity formation. Some of these pieces, like Manu Karuka's Empire's Tracks, weaved in storytelling to explore settler colonial social relations. To see the full list, you can check out our syllabus, which is posted on our website and also accessible through our social media.
Okay, so what is settler colonialism?
What an excellent place to start. Also a really difficult question. So as Sis mentioned, we didn't have a chance to read everything on this. So we need to start with a little bit of a caveat that we're looking at a particular form of colonialism. So we know that there are different forms of colonialism, like direct colonialism, indirect, and then settler colonialism. And we're looking specifically at settler colonialism primarily in the Americas and with a heavy focus in the United States. So with that caveat aside, one of the sort of main elements of settler colonialism is around land and territoriality, and also sort of a process that is ever unfolding. It's not a specific moment that, comes and goes, starts and ends, but is sort of renewed on a daily basis and takes on different forms along with the racialization process of Indigenous people. And so we see a couple of different aspects. So land, as I mentioned, land and territoriality, but also sort of an accumulation of land and nature. And we realize that under capitalism, nature does not include humans, that there's a separation between humans and an antagonism really between humans and nature. But sort of in a more broader total sense, settler colonialism is the accumulation of land and nature, which nature including humans, and also sort of reproducing this separation process. So in early moments of settler colonialism, we see a process of primitive accumulation that we've spoken about in past conversations around our race study, and so in short, the process of primitive accumulation sort of subsumes both land and, well, constant capital and variable capital in the form of resources and land and sort of everything that you need to sort of jumpstart capitalism alongside human labor. As settler colonial relations are produced and renewed, there's a separation between land and humans, and land and natural resources and all of the sort of like anything having to do with nature is made into private property. So this means the exclusive rights to use nature without gaining the consent of anyone are created. And, that could be a single person owning a piece of land or a collective group of people having ownership over a land and resources. Settler colonialism also takes on various strategies depending on the different form that it takes. So we read about strategies of elimination and assimilation, but both of these strategies are an attempt, again, to separate people from nature and accumulate land and natural resources as part of constant capital. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And lastly, one thing that we found important to highlight was that that settler colonialism is not separate from capitalism. So similar to how we studied in the past slave relations, there are some scholars and authors who ask the question, is slavery capitalist? And to us, that didn't make any sense because in the moment of slavery, capital is still mediating all of social relations, and the two can't really exist without each other, meaning slavery and capitalism. And similarly, settler colonialism and capitalism can't be separated. We don't see them as, independent systems, but sort of two sides of the same coin that are operating in tandem in order to accumulate capital and engage in this primitive accumulation process and alienate humans and, essentially erase the existence of a relationship between humans and nature. And along with that comes Indigenous racialization. And this is sort of the objective side of how Indigenous people are racialized under capitalism.
Okay, so can you talk more about how Indigenous racialization comes about, or how we can understand it?
Yeah. So one thing that we found helpful for thinking about, the question of what is race is comes from a piece we read in the first part of the study by FTC Manning. And in that piece, she proposes whether race or similarly gender are simply to be on one side of a social relation. And so that's kind of what we've been using to understand what race is and then also what racialization is. So in the case of Indigenous racialization, the social relation that we're looking at specifically is settler colonialism, as Eve mentioned. So on the side of the colonizer, the orientation to Indigenous people is attempted elimination. And a lot of the texts we looked at emphasize this relation. So for colonizers, what's important is accumulating land, extracting resources, etc., which are then used in the service of capitalist production, whether for real estate, as raw materials, or for waste. And in service of this aim, colonizers use a variety of strategies to manage Indigenous people who are seen merely as objects standing in the way of their accumulation. Concretely, this management takes different forms depending on the moment. And we can see this kind of throughout some of the texts that we read in different time periods. So in one period, this may look like outright genocide with mass murder as the tactic of colonizers. In other moments, it looks more like subsumption, attempting to assimilate Indigenous people into colonial capitalist relations, which could be or which has taken the form of dividing up communal property into private property, kidnapping Indigenous children and putting them in boarding schools to try to assimilate them into whiteness, and in even later moments, this may look like cultural recognition via the state, and for that to work, it implies that there's a mutual recognition of the state, or between the state and Indigenous nations. But what's important to highlight, although the tactics and the management strategies change over time, is that ultimately it's a relationship of control, elimination, erasure. And this relationship, which is kind of reproduced daily and throughout time, is a large part of the racialization process of Indigenous people. It's not the only part. This is, as Eve mentioned, this is kind of more looking at the objective factors, but it is a large part. And we wanted to kind of highlight one example of how this takes place, and that's the example of the mass slaughter of buffalo. So in the 1860s, the United States destroyed 10 to 15 million buffaloes. This happened in less than 2 decades, and almost wiped out entirely the population. And this followed directly from the signing of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty between the Lakota people and the United States government. And part of what that treaty said was that as long as the buffalo roamed on the territory that was in question in the treaty, the land shall belong to the Lakota people. And so what that meant is the United States government used that as kind of a loophole in order to just acquire that land. So while they made it seem like they were like giving this land to the Lakota people, what they did was they went and they slaughtered all of the buffalo so that the buffalo no longer roamed on the land, and the Lakota no longer had access legally to the territory. And it's also important to note that it's not just a legal relationship that was in question. The buffalo were the Lakota had a mutual and reciprocal relationship with the buffalo, and the buffalo were their means of survival. They hunted buffalo and they lived with buffalo, and so the slaughter of the buffalo wasn't just an attempt at gaining this land, but also an attempt at the elimination of the Lakota people. And then another example of how indigeneity as a race has been concretized is through the enforcement of blood quantum, which, as we read in one of the pieces, was first introduced at the time of the Dawes Act in 1887. And what the Dawes Act did was divide up communally owned land into individual allotments, which was part of a process of subsuming Indigenous people into capitalist relations, turning collective property into private property, and kind of destroying the social relations that already existed. And before distributing these lands, the U.S. government required that tribes provide lists of tribal members. And what they did was provide different rights to the land based on blood quantum. Those who they deemed to have so-called half-blood or less were given full title to the land and full United States citizenship, while everyone else had their lands put in trust. What this kind of expresses is what some of the other strategies that colonizers use also express, which is an attempt at elimination. This is different from hypodescent, or what's known as the one-drop rule, where, for example, a mixed-race child of a black parent and a white parent would be considered black. Blood quantum does the opposite, requiring a certain amount of so-called Native American blood to be considered for tribal membership. Again, another form of elimination. So in addition to kind of looking at these objective factors, we were able to consider some of the subjective factors that are part of Indigenous racialization. So one aspect is the relationship to the land. The very nature of the settler-colonial relation requires that Indigenous people have a pre-existing relationship to the land and to the resources, which is different from that of the colonizers. So one of the subjective aspects of Indigenous racialization and identity formation is this pre-existing relationship to the land and the struggle against the relationship that the colonizers are trying to establish. We also looked at in one of the pieces we looked at kind of claim making and the way that people either claim or deny Indigenous identity, and saw really kind of interestingly that in the post-Red Power moment, more people began identifying as Indigenous. More people claimed identity, and it seemed to be an important moment of self-identification. And that's something that you can't really begin to understand by just looking at the objective factors that contribute to racialization. And it's also something that, we want to look into further, because it sets up the possibility of people claiming Indigenous identity for purposes other than maintaining kinship relations. For example, the way that Andrea Smith claimed Indigenous identity in order to have access to the academy and to various privileges and money and resources. And then one other thing that we spoke about a bit in studying these texts was just kind of problematizing time and space, and kind of rejecting capitalist timelines and borders as what defines indigeneity. So a lot of times when we look at who is Indigenous, it really is it focuses on the moment of colonization, the moment that settlers came to this land. But that doesn't take into account some of the other subjective factors that we looked at, which is like a relationship to the land, a reciprocal relationship to the land, and excludes other people that have formed that relationship, such as Maroon communities or other Black Indigenous people. So that's one other aspect of this process that we're hoping to explore more.
Earlier, Sis mentioned gender as a side of a social relation when, talking about Indigenous racialization. Is there a relationship between gender and Indigenous racialization?
Yeah, absolutely. This is again, it's kind of a lesson that we learned in our first part of of our study, which was that we were looking at the Black-white relation in a certain sort of flattened way. And this time we're attempting to have a more dynamic understanding of race, which includes gender as, again, another sort of side of the prism that is capitalist relations, and one that's, mutually constituting. So in this section on settler colonialism, we looked at a couple of different examples of how gender is sort of violently established and reinforced, and then also as is part of the process of elimination and the separation of humans from the land. So there are three examples that I was going to discuss. The first one is sort of as colonizers were arriving on this land, they sort of refused to, they saw gender distinction and sort of read their own understanding onto that and refused to work with or trade with or have any kind of relationship other than, sort of violent sexual violence against non-men. So they, they saw gender distinctions and sort of bolstered that by only working with men, only dealing with men, and, encouraging hierarchies and power to develop within Indigenous communities. Secondly, we saw different sterilization and quote unquote family planning projects in Latin America. And this is something that, has continued. The contemporary, like the big contemporary example is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who, put, lots and lots of money toward quote unquote family planning processes. But yeah, so this is just so on the one hand, it's a way to actually control the numbers, and, dwindle down the numbers of Indigenous people through different methods. And then also it's a method of just controlling non-men and controlling people from, being able to assert their own autonomy over their bodies, their communities, their just reproduction in general. And then the final example, which I think we're going to continue to discuss and sort of theorize a bit about, is the establishment of man camps and the use of rape and the establishment of essentially sex slaves on the frontier. So again, this is something that, has continued today. But, so in the process of accumulating resources and sort of working the land, the stolen land, different work camps were set up, and essentially the men working in these camps, enacted, violent acts of rape against Indigenous women that were living nearby. And this is something that the state just sort of willfully ignored and, some would say encouraged as a way to control and eliminate Indigenous people, and specifically women and non-men. So, this is something that has continued and still goes on. And I think, the underreporting of trafficking and the sort of femicide and just straight up like disappearance of many Indigenous women every year is something that the state just willfully ignores, revealing itself as an actor in the process of elimination, genocide, and Indigenous erasure. And this is something that I think we're hoping to explore a bit more, because it also illuminates some contemporary debates around sex work, which I think there's some tendencies that argue that all sex work is rape. And while we disagree with that framework, we found this aspect of Indigenous racialization and gendering important as a way to understand how it's difficult to have to feel as though you have, or to, you know, objectively have control over your labor as like a quote unquote like capitalist free labor, if you're sort of treated as capitalism treats natural resources, which is to say you're expendable, you're you know, the property of, in this case, white men. And yeah, so it does complicate, you know, our understanding of sex work and the relationship between sex work and sex trafficking in a way that I think we should take seriously. But you know, it's something that I'm hoping that we can continue to discuss as we move through this study.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one short thing. Yeah, I just wanted to add in, from what Eve said, is that I think we can look back at intersectionality theory, which kind of gave us a method for looking at race and gender and other identities together with one another. And we see here, like, really strongly that race and gender can't be separated. Gender and gendered experiences are shaped through race and vice versa. And so we have to seriously, you know, study and consider the ways that, you know, not just the ways that race and capitalism co-create one another, but the ways that race and gender co-create one another, and you know, are all and all of the various social relations that make up the whole kind of shape and reform one another daily.
Definitely. Okay, so now that you've done this huge study, what are the practical implications of everything you've learned?
That's a big question. So, I mean, we've identified a few ways that what we've studied applies practically. I think one important thing is that it kind of opens up a critique of, you know, the project for communism being ownership of the means of production, or kind of redistribution. When we consider the way that settler colonialism and indigenous racialization unfolded, we can see that the fight is not just to the fight isn't to own the means of production. The fight is, you know, about freedom, and in a larger sense, abolishing the alienation that we experience through race, through our separation from nature, through our, you know, alienated work lives. But it's not just about kind of taking the capitalist machinery and using that and controlling that collectively. Kind of in a similar vein, what this study also does is kind of breaks down stagism and approaches that highlight a primary versus secondary contradiction, because we see through this that fighting in one area affects relations in another area. You know, fighting back against land accumulation and resource extraction is directly related to, you know, to production, to fights in workplaces, etc. Another thing that we see through this study is that Indigenous racialization and Black racialization are two sides of the same coin. At the same time that we're seeing the accumulation of land and resources, the elimination of Indigenous people, we're also seeing the kidnapping and enslavement of Black people, and both this accumulation and this forced labor are necessary in this moment for capitalism, and we would argue, in all moments, just in different forms. And practically what this does, in a more positive light, is that it provides a material and objective basis for solidarity. We've seen kind of throughout organizing that there can sometimes be feelings that like a focus on one form of struggle can overtake another and can take energy away from another. But when we understand that these social relations are part of kind of like a whole, and are necessary for one another, it provides a basis for collaboration and solidarity. And some examples we highlighted were just like the connection between the Flint water crisis and Standing Rock, which were, kind of emerging simultaneously. And also lived experiences around policing and surveillance on reservations, and also in inner cities, which is kind of a process of like further extracting from both communities, but also provides an opening for struggle on like a common basis. Studying indigeneity and settler colonialism is also helpful for us in breaking down the separation between humans and the natural world and attempting to end the human non-human binary. So moving forward as like in like a communist project, we're not attempting to kind of reinforce this binary by like building more national parks or enforcing this divide. What we're seeking to do is change our material conditions so that we no longer have to be and no longer are separate from nature.
All right. So what are some lingering questions and areas that you'd like to research further?
So yeah, we briefly mentioned a few of them, continuing the project of understanding racialization beyond the black-white binary, and, incorporating elements of intersectionality theory. There are a few things that we sort of earmarked that we want to continue to understand as racialization changes throughout history. So, for example, I think Sis mentioned this idea of claim making, and this is something that we find interesting, especially because as Sis mentioned, there are people like Andrew Smith who sort of got a lot of power through the process of claiming indigeneity. It's a bit contradictory because on the one hand, this post-Red Power moment where people are embracing and claiming indigeneity is really important. It's counteracting the process of erasing Indigenous people. At the same time, it's complicated because I think in our post-neoliberal sort of identity as a commodity moment, there's also a process of claiming indigeneity in order to effectively erase Indigenous people and gain power. So that's something that we're hoping, as we learn about how racialization takes shape, post Red Power and in our neoliberal moment, we can kind of, sort of flesh out that contradiction a bit. We're also looking at just how we understand different moments of accumulation and whether they are, categorically different or separate or parts of the same moment. So, we've talked a bit today about settler colonialism, primitive accumulation, and we're hoping in the future to also discuss imperialism. So there's some questions in the group about how, if these things are fundamentally different categories, or if they're, part of the same process, or if there's overlap. So we're hoping to kind of, have a little bit more texture to some of those different categories. And then also, there's some talk about maybe, some of these ideas being outdated for, like, for example, primitive accumulation. Is that a helpful term in our moment? Or perhaps I think for some, some of our nerdy, like sort of Marxoids, just a question about whether that's a misinterpretation, from German. So, yeah, so anyway, that's something that we're flagging. We want to have continued conversation about. We're hoping that people comment and sort of engage with our work here to help us learn together. And from here, so we move from this moment and just like kind of laying some basis around settler colonialism. And we're kind of like picking up historically where we left off from part one, which is to start learning about the Reconstruction moment and the 1860s to 1870s period. And yeah, we're hoping to just continue some of these conversations through that lens as well.
Awesome. I look forward to that. Okay, so this concludes, I guess, this episode. This has been awesome work so far, and I'm very thankful to Unity and Struggle for putting on this race study, and to Eve and Sis in particular for sharing these findings. There's 2 more sections of part 2 of the race study, so be sure to subscribe to join us on our research. Thanks so much for joining us in this endeavor, and please share and comment on this episode to expand our reach. We'd love to hear from you on social media as well. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is @UnityandStrug. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.